This might be too much of a disjointed recording. I feel like I'm not going to upload probably about 4 hours of recordings that I made because it was me talking about a particular argument and I kept on making tangents, which were all quite interesting but somewhat disparate. And some of those tangents were quite interesting, so I feel like at least the one aspect of it I feel like I must repeat, which is I give actually a very good definition of psychopath, which was kind of not what I was intending to even talk about. Um, Actually, it's not. It's a good model to understand psychopathy in some sense. It's not. And then after watching some Sam Vaknin recordings on personality disorder, that got me thinking that I really want to sort of get into the fray and correct what I see as some recurring. Yeah, so I mean I don't have it. If I would actually do some diligent note taking and get all my thoughts in order, I could probably speak about it much more intelligently. But because I don't have the full resources to probably talk about psychopathy, because I haven't properly, my mind is too concerned with narcissism and borderline personality disorder. Um, and I do think I'm coming close to synthesizing, because the key to all of these disorders is the inner child, the unconscious side of the mind. The unconscious side of the mind really has to be. All of these disorders all have configure. The one thing that they all share is structure. Not, they don't share the same structures, but they all have a particular distinct structure that will define them as either a psychopath or whatever. And those structures, in terms of how they are mapped in the unconscious side of the mind, the inner child, the constitution of the inner child, as it were, then you'll start to be able to see why there's so much metaphorical, analogous overlapping between these personality styles. Although the presentation is quite different, but the themes are similar, even though they present and manifest in various ways. So, and I'm going to give some of those rough indications now. So, I mean, I'm going to give some of these rough factors. So, and I'm also going to step into the fray and see what I and say what I regard as being. Sadly, I don't even have the full answer for this one as well, but I'm coming very close to vocalizing it. I need to think about it more, but essentially, I'm going to roughly outline that all the stuff that is being said about borderline, I disagree with it entirely. In terms of how the implication of the inner constitute. I mean, I guess it's because I guess I can't say that I disagree with what's being said, because what's being said about it is just so vague anyway. So let me just try to be more precise than the vague things that Sam Vaknin. Uh, uh, I mean, obviously, at least he's describing things that are tangible in some sense, or I mean, I guess I don't consume much other sources of information, and I consider him to be on on point for collating all the pertinent data and research and theoretical descriptions. So I mean, I'm very glad that he's doing all the research and anyway, because it helps me to at least ground myself and contra- and construct my point in contradistinction to the general field, perhaps, as surveyed by Sam Wagner. So anyway, borderline is the more sophisticated one than the other personality styles in some sense, although I do think it's much closer to psychopathy than anything else. Borderline is in some sense, I think borderline is actually a species of psychopathy. That's exactly what it is. So and I'll go into that now. So I'll go into narcissism first. So essentially, I've described that if you work in any side of the mind, and you have to take my ontological model of this to make sense of it. So my ontological model is you have the superego, which develops the inner child develops the subconscious develops the ego function. That is the ontological chain. Okay, so a narcissist, now if you operate anything on any side of the mind, you implicitly create a naive sphere of action that you are virtually related to or interrelating with. That is just a kind of incontrovertible sort of facility that is being expressed, and that in some sense you will be able to immediately map within even the prior side of the mind. So if you have inner child belief structures and you are operating with them, because essentially you're going to eventually beliefs are going to lead to other beliefs, and there's going to be a certain I'm not going to find the precise words, but I'll just get through it, get through this matter by just being crude or whatever. So in some sense, there's a natural, like, sexual selection of beliefs that's going on in some sense, and beliefs will propagate other beliefs and will lead to other beliefs, and there'll be a kind of there will be a natural generative form that the beliefs will be conditioned within their own internal competition, as it were. And let's say the internal feedback between those beliefs, in some sense, will intimate a naive level of the next side of the mind. So there is a naive subconscious domain, paradigm, that the beliefs themselves are intrinsically, let's say, acting upon each other in some sense. And this is why it is natural that most people, when they mature, when they develop, or when they develop experience in any side of the mind, will naturally develop structures that interlead them into fostering the development and the articulation of the next side of the mind. Now, a narcissist, in some sense, you can, I think another way of describing personality disorders, especially the cluster B personality disorders, because my mind is not familiar with cluster A and cluster C, at least right now, although, it's amazing how I can deal with things in such detail, and then they leave my mind when I'm not dealing with them. But that's probably because of the depth of the level of analysis that I'm usually contending with, so much so that I'm even embarrassed when I realize that I make up my own semantics a lot of the time, and I call things histrionic disorder, and I'm probably very far away from the clinical description. Anyway, well, I need to actually check up on that. I'm not even sure how far off I am. Because I mean, when I'm talking about, or the model that I was talking about, or the construct that I was trying to talk about was, I kept on referring it to cerebral histrionic disorder, but perhaps I should have called it rather a kind of cerebral inverted borderline sort of temperament. Anyway, that's a tangent. But okay, so I think my model for all personality disorders, in some sense, is that they conglomerate or they amalgamate two sides of the mind. So what a narcissist effectively is trying to do is they are trying to encapsulate the whole field of the subconscious into the inner child. So the inner child wants to have a kind of has actually created a sandbox within its belief structure that is meant to sort of supplement the subconscious. And so they have fathomed that there is a kind of feedback which their beliefs were prone to, which were akin to something that would normally beckon someone to mature and develop into acting in that sphere of action and moving their seat of consciousness into it. In some sense, the narcissist just kind of enveloped that domain and sort of subverted it at the same time and sort of completely and created this weird sort of power relation that's kind of autistic, but the power relation, that's a very vague metaphor, is because emotions themselves, it's very hard to understand exactly what's gone wrong unless one actually has a model as to, let's say, the healthy version of the side of the mind that has been amalgamated and captivated. Now, psychopathy is very different because in some sense, psychopathy is like the inner child and the ego function have been amalgamated. And they together are triangulating against the subconscious. So the subconscious becomes a kind of a codependent correlate. I shouldn't use the word codependent, but is like a parallel I can never say this word. Correlate. Okay, I'll just say it in the past participle. The subconscious is just a parallel correlate to the inner child and ego function pair. So in some sense, the subconscious is an afterthought in some sense, but it's in the same way that a narcissist needs verification from an exterior locus of control to validate the internal structures. For a psychopath, they have quite the same thing, but because they have to find a correlate with both their inner child, which is their beliefs, and their ego function, which is their teleos, their purpose. Now you see, because they have amalgamated their teleos and their belief structure, that gives them both a huge amount of flexibility in their ability to pretend, as it were, to create and I can't think of how to express this. So, I mean, it's just like in what Sam Wagner was saying. They're like Disneyland. They create, they can create a show. They can create a perfect show. But why are they creating the show? See, they can also be creative on that side. So they can be masterfully creative in terms of tailoring an experience and knowing how it will be received or something, or imagining how it will be received. And then they also have a tremendous set of creativity as to the criteria that they would have to meet in order to actually deploy those talents as it were, those powers that they have. So they have both as a particular ability to entrance a subconscious game piece, somebody else's feeling body, somebody else's subconscious interrelated mask. Uh, they can create their own mask as well, to marry with that mask, to interrelate with that mask. So the mask that they create is also very much open to invention. But as much as they can invent their mask and how they would entrance somebody else's mask, all the precision that they have in fine-tuning that has a sort of double-edged whammy on the other side of it, which is that if they fail to achieve the intention that they had already set, and that they had already, now in some sense that they can always sort of reconfigure it to some degree, but they can only reconfigure it that, man, I was about to make a mathematical geometric analogy, and it's actually it's a bad analogy because it's too abstract. What was I going to say? I was going to say that they have, okay, this is such a failed analogy, but anyway, I'm just going to use it anyway, even though it doesn't quite work. But in some sense, they've got these 2 points. They've got their retrospective reference of what they have done, their teleos, their sense of purpose that they apply to their belief structure. And that belief structure and that sense of accomplishment, or derived, sort of dopamine, uh, which I would say is indicative of the ego function, those 2 points make a line. And the line has to be a straight line. They can't meander it around. The line connecting those 2 points has to be the shortest distance. It has to be a straight line. It cannot. And so if that's the only sort of limit that they have, is that, and that's how you know you're dealing with someone that effectively doesn't have their own three-dimensional subconscious mask. They don't have a subconscious mask which is capable of doing anything than just plotting the shortest distance from A to B in some sense. And so their subconscious mask, if you got a hold of it, in some sense, it might be part of an elaborate act. It might be part of an elaborate game, in some sense, that they planned it out. But it's, in essence, what you would want out of a subconscious mask, because the subconscious is only capable of making masks, and a healthy subconscious is one that will remake its mask, and after apologizing that the last mask was was deficient in some sense, or that, I mean, in a healthy culture, people would allow themselves and allow others to redefine to renegotiate their masks, to reconcile and to update and to revise. Because in some sense, the mask is just the latest condensed compilation of the pertinent beliefs that are being deployed in a particular sphere of action, because the subconscious is sort of tethered to time and place and other contexts, and those contexts are always in a kind of are in some sense of a flux, because one does not manifest a subconscious. There's no such thing as a universal subconscious. It's that's the ego function. In some sense, that's what the ego function is. The ego function is meant to be the universal subconscious. And when you start operating a subconscious, you start to generate that universal paradigm, as it were. And so the subconscious is being meta-analyzed in some sense. And its contents and is being referenced to its past contents and its hypothetical future contexts, and that's the domain of the ego function. But anyway, the subconscious in some sense is the incarnated actualization and deployment of particular sets of beliefs that are pertinent to a particular time and place and context. It is an embodied set of beliefs, which is always going to be by definition a subset, because one cannot embody the totality of one's beliefs, because also one does not know the totality of one's own beliefs, because they haven't been fully worked out. That is the embodiment process that is the subconscious. So the subconscious is a kind of your beliefs in action, and because it is a subset of those beliefs, that's why we get the feeling of disgust, because in some sense we're getting a visceral internal feedback that our beliefs are dissonant. And in some sense, the height of the subconscious is right in the middle of the false ego complex, and it is the most important thing, because in some sense it is also the bridge between the ego function and the inner child. And so if you can actually master the subconscious, in some sense, that is the height of maturity. That is the height, in some sense, you'll know that your ego function is properly developed and functioning perfectly or functioning well if the subconscious is capable of manifesting some of the sort of the ideal behavior that I was just describing. That it's capable of resigning itself and recapitulating a new form, and is capable of facilitating that, which in some sense you could say is dependent on external culture or external factors or external context, or at least developing a kind of culture of communication so that it's capable of facilitating that. Because in some sense you could say that it's always possible to facilitate that, but it's do you have the words, do you have that kind of that practical embodied ability to make those maneuvers? And so just the actual work that the subconscious physically does, as it were, and has physically done, is one of the most important sort of features of developing let's say, confidence that one's inner child is hasn't been completely um, atrophied in some sense. Let me just make a slight scriptural parallel. It says in the scriptures that oh man, I can't even remember exactly what it says, but it says something like, "Blessed are they who, um, or blessed are they who know their spiritual." Uh, damn, no, I can't even remember. Is it spiritual weakness or spiritual needs or something like that? Yeah, blessed are they that know their spiritual need, or their something about their need, or weakness. I can't remember. Something like that. I'm really actually butchering this. So it's I believe that particular scripture that I butchered is referring to the state of the inner child, because a lot of people, they have this kind of, they're just completely locked between their subconscious and their ego function, and essentially their inner child is just locked into a kind of unconscious fractured dissonance, and it has no maneuvering with which to kind of reconstitute itself into, and so that is the only true end. When I say true, I mean relatively speaking, that is the only true unit entity within the entire false ego structure, is the inner child. The inner child is the initiator of all the other sides of the mind, and the state of the inner child, in some sense, is the state of the stability of the personality at all. And so, anyway, I was going to go on to say that essentially borderlines are actually much closer to psychopaths than they are any other personality style that I can see. Although in some sense they can all be likened to narcissists, because they will all, at least at the very least, always all have them. They will all have inner child structures. Now, the reason why I think that borderline should be mainly just considered a subspecies of psychopaths is because, look, I will accept that they appear very differently than psychopaths in their presentation in some sense, but I think that they actually just have antisocial personality disorder. They just have one more thing than psychopaths, and that is, they have worked out, and I think this is why why it is that so many women have borderline as opposed to also not men, is because these psychopaths have merely learnt that there is a way to compel people, to control people, and there is this cultural edifice already. Um, you can call it sort of female privilege or something, or whatever, but sexuality, the power of sexuality, um, the kind of courtly, the traditional conventions of and I do think borderline is sort of geared around capitalizing around as much cultural levers, as much subconscious, let's say, framings as are available to them, and they've worked out that it's quite advantageous to them to sort of to use those as the rough fencing in the maze that they want to ensnare a kind of codependent vessel. Now, in some sense, I think that the kind of psychopath that they are a psychopath that has effectively modeled you see I've just forced myself to compare it with psychopathy, and I haven't done enough thinking about pure psychopathy. Um, but I'll just stick to my simple model anyway. That essentially I see them as psychopaths with one extra instrument, and that instrument is what I've already described as the glass house defense. So that's all they are. They are psychopaths that have worked out that they can use the glass house defense to get whatever they want, because they can portray whatever complexity, whatever dramatic, and this is why they have so many different dramas that they can deploy in alternative to one another. All their maneuvers, I mean, the decompartmentalization, the sending of envelopes that are designed to decompartmentalize and to perform a kind of slow degradation of the other person's um, subconscious boundary, so that they can sort of force them, and they've got the elements of the kind of the narcissism, of the shared fantasy. You know, they're trying to find any means possible to attach to someone that they can essentially control. And in some sense, that's the overarching theme of the borderline, is the control of another person. That's all they care about, is controlling. And so, and and then the weird thing is that their vector of control is a a two-faced coin, and one of those faces is a subconscious presence which they have to emulate and simulate, as it were. But that simulation is perhaps, it crosses the line that it's not just a simulation. They emulate it in terms of their inner child as well. So they actually have, let's say, a glass house that extends between the subconscious and the inner child. And within that glass house is just a kind of it's a play. It's an act, and they even have multiple different players which they portray on that stage, and then they keep on trying to find the appropriate one to deploy at the appropriate time, so that people will be forced to look in, to glance at at the glass house, and see what's happening inside of it, and be captivated by that action, by that drama, and then have to sort of sympathize and form the attachment, and take on the exposure of being impressed by that, being imprinted by what it is signaling and displaying. But if you just unify all of that, dysregulation and stuff like that as a glass house, and you just look at the kind of psychopathic behavior that they get into when they are frustrated in not being received, in not having the glass house function as a control mechanism. So yes, you can say that they suffer for that control mechanism, for that part of the control mechanism. But then as soon as that control mechanism seems to have absolutely no purchase on their intended target, then you see what I would consider to be the real character of the personality without that instrument. And then you see what Sam Buckman correctly describes as the part psychopath, part narcissist, and in some sense they have these two sides, but that's just because they also, just like a psychopath, they have an inner child, and they have an ego function which is working in tandem to triangulate against the subconscious. But it's just that the psychopath, it's all internalized, and they just want to entrance somebody else's subconscious as just a kind of grandiosity sort of thing. Uh, um, the borderline also is grandiose, but it's grandiose about control. If it doesn't achieve the control, and in some sense, it's not even about getting something, it's just about getting the control. And in some sense, that is why they're so destructive and abrasive, because it's not about control for some end. It's more like, in some sense, they're more narcissistic than they are psychopathic. In the, I should rather say that in the technical sense. Forget what I just said. It, they are more inner child than they are ego function, whereas the psychopath, in some sense, is perhaps slightly more ego function than they are inner child. The psychopath is slightly, I think, the 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 ego function, the solidity of the ego function is prioritized. In the borderline, the solidity of the inner child, the chess playing demon that I've described before, is prioritized over the ego function. But the ego function very clearly looks psychopathic because they know that they're operating in tandem with their ego function. They know that they're deploying ego function rationale and ego function signaling and things like that, and they're presenting a form of ego function. But I mean, it's psychopathic because it just has no consistency. It's just completely incoherent. They will never, they will always just be annoyed when people don't trust them this time. It's sort of their ego function exists in order to extract an endless amount of continuing chances and trust, and it's just there to receive that part of the equation of the control, because they need a presence there in order to receive that. It's just there to sort of pad their credential for their inner child. So in some sense, I think the psychopath, perhaps the pure psychopath, has tried to encapsulate their inner child into their ego function, or whereas the borderline is doing it the other way around. They're trying to encapsulate their ego function into their inner child. And that is why the psychopath is so obsessed with self-consistency. And they have to make that line straight of self-consistency. Um, the problem with the psychopath really is that they get very dry because their belief structures have stopped being generative. They can have interesting conundrums in that they have certain matrices of belief that have a kind of that contain a lot of possibility. And I mean, I've spoken to some psychopaths. Um, they've always found me very interesting because I've always been able to say things that actually shatter their paradigms. Um, and that is simply because they don't have the same connection. they have a certain mastery over the subconscious, but because they don't have an organic fluid connection between their subconscious and their inner child, they don't get proper feedback against their belief structure. And so their belief structure is sophisticated in a very non-fruitful way. I guess elaborated is actually, it's very elaborated, but it's not generative. And that often creates patterns where they often can generate thinking that, it's very sophisticated, and I'm very interested in some of the cerebral insights that they have, um, because they've thought long and hard on certain facets, and certain, and they've created very, very strict paradigms, and often I can use those paradigms and get quite a lot of insight from them because they've technically worked them out in very, very fine ways. But the problem is that I've always had to make metaphors out of them because I've just found them to be so childish, really. Because although it's a sophisticated chess game that they have essentially worked out, it's pathetically bound into a very basic consideration that you can tell that sort of they came up with this when perhaps they were 5 years old and they're still working on the same chessboard. And I mean, that's not to say that 5-year-olds can't be geniuses and come up with very sophisticated, insightful, um, and valuable scopes on things, but essentially because they never worked out a proper integrated subconscious, that they never leveled that chess game up. They never unfolded it in the way that it should have been further developed. And so I do always find it interesting because I can always metaphorically extract something interesting from it. And it's very interesting because when I sort of talk to them about those insights, they always think, oh no, but that's why that issue is closed off and we can't go into that matter, and this is the prime chess game. And then it usually can take quite a lot to sort of argue them to move out of that paradigm. And it's interesting because they are actually quite honest, although they might not admit it. um, it can be hard to get them to even listen to your arguments in some sense. But I remember having long, long discussions with a few different psychopaths and completely shattering. This is why I think it's not biological. I think that these are psychological. Um, these are psychological structures. Although the ingrained pattern might lead them to want to replace one chessboard for another, but and it might take some time for, let's say, neuroplasticity to sort of work its magic. But I don't think anything in these structures are biologically immutable, or at least not in these structures. Anyway, borderlines though are problematic because they oh yeah, I have a very good way of describing it. The problem with the borderline is because they essentially have these two vectors of engagement. They have the glass house, and then they have let's say, their true self, which is often quite silent and will only show itself when they're essentially trying to sadistically punish you and wear you down into accepting to sort of to be the audience for their glass house vector of control. So that's the sort of the carrot, is just be the pliable audience to the glass house portrayal of drama that then you absorb and codependently, sort of are controlled through, or I'm going to essentially punish you. Um, those are the two sorts of, sort of the carrot and the stick. But in some sense, I mean, the problem is that they always pretend to be trustworthy, and that they are responsible. But then when they do that, they're not accountable for their actions. At least, they're not accountable for their past behavior. Or if they are accountable for their past behavior, then when they are supposedly saying that, then they are simultaneously not responsible for for their current actions, and if they admit to being accountable for their past actions, then that makes them immune to being responsible for their current ones. And okay, that's a bit of a bulky. It's not such a neat conceptual sort of tool, but in some sense, I think that that model very clearly shows me the dimension of their ongoing pathology and depravity, and their abrasiveness on the level of the subconscious. That's in some sense the only meta rule that they have, which you can consistently see being perpetrated. And to me, that rule, although it can be expressed as an alternative, so it can be that formula can be deployed in two different ways. That either that they will give you responsibility, but then they have no accountability, or they'll give you their accountability and then they have no responsibility. So those are the two levers that they have to sort of uh, and it's basically through in some sense I think that they are both. I think in some sense they do perhaps have one split personality, that they, in essence, they are two kinds of psychopaths. They are actually a primary and a secondary psychopath. I think that's actually what they are. That they are an ego function psychopath, and they are an inner child psychopath that has incorporated the ego function, and they are an ego function primary psychopath that has incorporated their inner child, and they are just working in tag team essentially. They just swap between each other when the one is starting to seem like they're being, and so the inner child is the preferred one, is not the primary psychopath, but is the primary mode, that is the engine and the brain also for operating this, and the other psychopath, and I really do think that the primary, they are also a primary psychopath. They're not, so like I don't know, maybe Sam Vaknin is using these words in ways that I don't understand, because when he says that they're a secondary psychopath, and he means that they only are psychopathic half the time. No, they're psychopathic all the time, and then they are, and then sometimes they are full blown psychopath, obviously psychopathic. So I think that when I hear the word secondary psychopath, they are always that secondary psychopathic, and then sometimes they are like they switch on into full blown primary psychopathy as a leading thread, um, which is essentially used to cover up the secondary ploy. But I mean, then I guess you have to follow my model that the glasshouse defense is a sub process, is a sub component of in some sense, I wouldn't even be surprised if I'm not if I'm like actually sort of incorrect about, I mean, what does it even mean to have two of these things? In some sense, that might be true in some sort of practical sense, that there are these two personalities, these two primary ones, and one of them is even create capable of creating a myriad of displays within the glass house. So I mean, that's not counting all the myriad characters that the glass house gets populated with in order to facilitate the control. But I think that perhaps the whole inner child, in some sense, the whole inner child control mechanism through the glasshouse defense and the decompartmentalization, that might all be essentially conducted by the ego function, conducted by the primary psychopathy. That the primary psychopathy, in some sense, doubled back on itself, that developed itself as primary psychopathy, and then actually decided that it would even relegate itself or make itself second fiddle, because this would be a sweeter mode of in some sense, yeah, no, I'm about to contradict myself, but you see, I perhaps I need to do more research on psychopaths, but I think the thing about psychopaths is that generally they compromise relative to their targets, right? Relative to the associations that they have. That their world is a world of compromise, whereas the the borderline, if they are this special type of psychopath, has gone back to their inner child so that they don't have to compromise. They have created this instrument within their inner child so that they could essentially tap into the narcissistic uh, resource of essentially having a stable subconscious that exists within the inner child. The problem is that then they have the problem that the narcissist has, that they need an external validation in order to know that it's real, in order to verify it. They have a verification problem. And so and then that's what essentially leads them to being codependent, is because they need someone to tether that that sandbox, or that to energize it with somebody else's subconscious authenticity. So they need a good source of sort of um, narcissistic supply, just to, it shouldn't even be called narcissistic supply in the case of the borderline, perhaps it should be called it's not attention, but it is attentiveness. They need to be seeded attentiveness that they take, that they control, that um, they need to be catered to. Uh, they need their but they don't need it like a narcissist needs narcissistic supply. They need it, I feel, because they need that straight line between their ego function and their inner child. They need that shortest possible distance, but they also have the shortest possible distance aimed towards their best target ever, which, so in some sense, they they have higher standards than a psychopath. See, this is the thing, is that I see them, they are more psychopathic than anything else, but they have a more sophisticated measure of engaging with a target. I guess the motivation for them needing somebody else is more narcissistic. But yeah, so in some sense, they were a psychopath before they were a narcissist, is what I'm saying. And then there might also be internal problems because of these structures. Because in a practical sense, then they do perhaps have two competing valences. They've got, let's say, the primary psychopath, and then they've got this sort of the inner child mechanic, which I think also sort of suffers from a kind of ontological confusion, because the inner child preceded the ego function, but the ego function is headlining the inner child's so what I'm just trying to say is that the inner child is somewhat has been subverted into this kind of teleological paradigm of why it's activating what it's activating. So, in some sense, there is this huge, almost existential angst and despair that the borderline is subject to because its inner child is untethered from its own superego and it's being relayed through the ego function. So there's a tremendous internal I don't know what I can say, like cross wiring problem. Um, which is creating a double bind on the subconscious. Which I guess in some sense is like the whole thing that the inner child is trying to compensate for and project in such a way as to facilitate. So the ego function needs a scapegoat, and the inner child uh, is modeling a glass house portrayal of drama that is essentially a Trojan horse that, when it gets sympathized with, is going to facilitate the kind of the offloading of this kind of accountability. And so, they are modeling responsibility and accountability within the glass house in these weird subversive themes that are meant to sort of impregnate um, a sense of disorientation and confusion and convolution and conflating of subject matter. I mean, essentially, they are very corrosive to other people's subconscious. I mean, many people, in some sense, after a long enough exposure, will always feel the burden of it. But I mean, I'm particularly myself. I'm incredibly sensitive, so I can pick up the minutiae. I can start picking up the patterns very, very quickly as to the depth of subversive decompartmentalization, the level of the indirect manipulation and such. But I'm too tired. I'm too tired to do this topic much more justice. I I should have focused more on one of the aspects that I brought up about the circuit mismatch. But at least that's most of the content. I mean, yeah. So I mean, the detail is obviously very important, but at least in rough outline, I think those are the main factors. There were some caveats that I wanted to lay down, and now I can't even remember them. There were some other speculations and caveats that I needed to make about this whole topic. Damn, I'm too tired now. Okay, I'm just going to end this recording. Okay, this is all going to continue to be a bit of an embarrassing recording, but anyway, embarrassing because I don't have all my thoughts collected on psychopathy and isolation, and I feel like I'm going to be making comments that are going to be horribly speculative and with a degree of inaccuracy, because I'm going to try to make contrasts with psychopathy, and they're not going to be accurate probably. So anyway, huge grain of salt in that direction in on that particular point. But anyway, so my speculation is, in essence, that the borderline is primarily a psychopath. And when I said that there are two entities with the borderline, I should probably have to sort of revise that in practical terms to say that there are three, because there's the glass house, which belongs to the inner child, belongs to the kind of the narcissistic inner child that has this very special sandbox, that has this very special form of idealization in which they make them they have a subconscious mask which is prone to drama, which they are exhibiting through the glass house. And then they've got all these different machinations, and they've got all these different iterations of play that they can put on within the glass house, and they have no qualms cycling through those very, very quickly and cycling between them. Then if the whole glass house sort of gets as a, this is the same thing as when Sam Vaknin calls the subconscious of the borderline a cloud. I will just call it the glass house, because I believe that it's meant to be witnessed. It's meant to have an audience. It's meant to sort of attach to somebody else. The cloud, as it were, is meant to envelop a target, a host. But if that whole mechanism, if the cloud fails, then the parent of all these structures, in essence, activates, which is, I believe, the primary psychopath, which was the underlying modus operandi all along. So in some sense, I think the borderline developed psychopathy, which I believe is a top-heavy affair, is an ego function-heavy affair, that the inner child has actually been able to facilitate the seat of consciousness moving through a triangulated, fixed, reflective, muted subconscious, an overwhelmed subconscious that gets overwhelmed by an ego function. And then the ego function in this particular psychopath case of the borderline has then decided to re-engineer the inner child within the ego function, has tried to adopt the ego function. The ego function has tried to adopt the inner child and simulate it, and sort of and or rather emulate it, emulate the inner child, which amounts to essentially looking at one's own inner child autistically, in essence, and conducting it from the ego function. And the orchestration of this leads to the glass house. So they've got their ego function surveying their inner child belief structures, data banks, things like that. And then they're using that to construct the glass house extension into the subconscious. So the ego function is telling the inner child how to construct a glass house that's going to be able to vector in and cajole and what's the word, and plot against the masks. So essentially, because other people can be tied to their masks, their subconscious masks, but the borderline itself is not tethered in such a way. So they can essentially, in terms of both their ego function and their inner child belief structure, they can just cobble together whatever materials. And if something almost worked, but it seemed to work in some dimensions and then failed, then they will recapitulate a new recipe, they will take the leftover resources, and essentially they will just keep on plotting against, let's say, the consistency of somebody else's subconscious mask. Now, this is why they like narcissists, because narcissists as targets, because narcissists have a false self which can be plotted against rather simply, because the false self essentially is just an inner child plus a subconscious encapsulation of the inner child. And this makes the narcissist a rather simple target to outmaneuver and outgame, whereas the borderline has both the ego function and the inner child, and essentially they have a missing piece of the puzzle in terms of the subconscious, and then they need essentially to associate with someone who will. I believe that they are trying to get into the Hall of Mirrors. That's their end game. The borderline wants to set up a culture of the Hall of Mirrors. I don't think the narcissist, sorry, the House of Mirrors. Yeah, sorry, I've got that Hall of Mirrors in my head because I heard Sam Wagner say it, but I don't understand this reference of the Hall of Mirrors to narcissists. I mean, other than just a way of describing their self-delusion, confabulation that they get into, you know, that they have a poor reference to reality. So in some sense, the Hall of Mirrors is a, but anyway, the House of Mirrors is such an important feature of borderline that I don't want to say anything similar to narcissism, especially when, I mean, yes, they are like a narcissist. I would describe as like an autist in relation to the subconscious. Um, they need an enabler. They need the narcissist needs a subconscious enabler. I don't know if I would call that a Hall of Mirrors. Um, I mean, yeah, thematically it has purchase, but anyway, I don't want to get it confused with the things that are going on in borderline. Um, so the psychopath, I still haven't, you see, I haven't answered this question in my own mind. Like, what does the psychopath want with the subconscious? In some sense, the psychopath needs validation that it is actually dealing in straight lines between the ego function and the inner child. It just needs a medium to cut through, to know that, to verify that it has mastery, in that it is efficient, or it's so in some sense the subconscious for a for a psychopath is just a consistency checker. It's just a it's just a way of knowing that the internal symmetry between the ego function and the inner child, in some sense, it's a kind of, in the same way that a narcissist, it's very, very analogous. This is a loose analogy. It's very, very analogous to the kind of the meta manifestations of certain pathologies, um, in these pathological personality disorders, in the same way that a narcissist can engage in co-idealization, and that has its own sort of internal feedback, that when you use it, you also become prone to deploying that tactic or that mechanism. In the same way, the psychopath is sort of dealing in a kind of consistency checker with its subconscious, and then if it does that, if it decides to sort of, if it sets its sights on that mechanism, then that also makes it prone um, to being a chink in the armor, in some sense. So it sort of, if it makes that pursuit, then it's locked into having to double down into it, or being attracted by it itself, and sort of threatening the other structures that then have sort of deployed itself in that co co subconscious consistency sort of exploration or adventure. So that they've created a sort of an adventure in the one side of the mind that it doesn't already have a foot in. Now, in some sense, the borderline does have a foot in the subconscious. It's called the glass house. So the borderline has a glass house, which is a sort of a co-mixture between subconscious and inner child. And even the inner child itself is a pawn of the ego function. So in some sense, the borderline does have, let's say, an uneasy relationship between the ego function and the inner child. The borderline does have internal tension, as it were, and the inner child, in some sense, does feel duped, because it is being the kind of the cat's paw of the ego function, and it has been also then made diminutive. It's been made to sort of emulate these things, and so that whole internal structure, as it were, is intrinsically psychopathic. This is just a sophisticated form of psychopathy, where it's using some of its own internal structures in order to pave the way for the success of the psychopathy. So it's sort of, it's a psychopathic engine that has a way of effectively diverting attention from its operative pathology or whatever, because it sacrifices some of its own self into the mix. It makes its inner child have to emulate whatever is going on in the glass house. But there is even a distinction between the glass house and outside the glass house. It's when essentially the whole inner child is repudiated. The whole inner child, essentially, when the borderline is being addressed in terms of its ego function by its intended target, and the intended target, let's just say, has decided to not to not be the audience of the glass house defense of the borderline, to not receive and be entranced by the internal disorder and dismay and a negative emotion, or whatever, and just wants to have an intellectual um, ego function to ego function, troubleshooting, fact checking, you know, sort of debugging um, kind of negotiation, then the inner child is at risk, because then if the inner child cannot deploy more decompartmentalization, more envelopes of tactically manipulated, you know, because essentially you have to realize that essentially even if you get past the glass house, you're still dealing with a narcissist. And then if you repudiate the narcissist so that there's no hope that it can sort of get into its preferred mode of carrot led manipulation over the target subconscious, then all you're left with is um is the psychopath, is the psychopathy of the ego function. But you have to understand what is actually at the deepest level in some sense. So now then there's the inner child before the psychopath. You have to realize that psychopathy doesn't just arise out of nothing. I'm talking about this practical manifestation of the pathology. What goes deeper than that is that, well, the inner child first actually had to seed the seat of consciousness to the ego function for it to have psychopathy in the first place. Okay, so we have to realize that there is an inner child issue underneath the psychopathy, but people aren't even piercing the psychopathy because there's so much of the circus going on around it, insulating it. Now, I want to talk about psychopathic narcissists. So, psychopathic narcissists, in some sense, also have this almost this two these two personalities. They have the narcissistic inner child, and then they have the psychopathic ego function, and essentially, they have grown that ego function from the preferred, again, they're narcissists. Their preferred mode of interaction is I think the narcissistic psychopath. Okay, in some sense, there are sort of two. It starts to get complicated. That there are two seats of consciousness in some sense, and then the question is, well, which one is preeminent? Which one is in power? And that's not obvious. You could say that essentially, I mean, because when you've got an ego function involved at all, you start having to deal with a different kind of accounting, because you have to ask, well, there's the ontological and there's the epistemological, um, or the epistemic. So there's an epistemic thread, and which is what the ego function cares about, and then there's a kind of ontological thread with the inner child. So, I mean, this is the natural argument that is going on within every person's false ego complex, that the inner child holds the key to the ontological source of energy, and it is also the primordial unit of that energy in the false ego complex is the inner child, the lust and the death, as it were, which animates all the other structures and all the other sides of the mind, even, except for except for the superego. But it does actually, it has captured, in some sense, that's what gives the inner child the actual identity of having a fully constituted sense of man. I'm going through this too quickly, but anyway, that's what gives it its engine of awareness. That's what gives it its container of contemplative framing. I was going to say like that's what gives it its sense of self, but you know, like I need to square the circle of, well, it's a false self, but I mean that just simply means that its origin is fictitious, or it's anyway. I don't want to get into that matter right now. Anyway, the ego function is a meta-analysis of the feeling body, which is already meant. The feeling body is just essentially the intricate the delicate matter of essentially creating subsets of beliefs that are contextually um, embodied in particular spheres of action. So they're sort of their time and place, they're contextualized in time and place and interrelatedness. You know, the context of time and place is the context of you know, I mean that sort of perhaps abstractly or metaphorically. You know, the I'm just trying to think of some of the Scientology things are quite would probably actually define this much more clearly in terms of context, as in the havingness of people's, man, I can't remember the havingness of people's reality, and the distance, the space between their, their communication, or no, the communication is the actual content or the subject matter. Okay, anyway, then this is not just I mean that would have been nice to lay that out off the top of my head, but anyway, let me just move on. But essentially, the subconscious is articulating um, some portion, and hopefully it's if you've culturally organized your affairs correctly, then it's okay to represent portions of your entire belief structure, portions, because you can't represent it all, you can't embody it all at the same time. And so because you embody, I mean, very small children can embody it all, which is why they're capable of essentially, I mean, this is also why narcissists have this abstract sense of impending, you know, they know what's potting, they know what's happening, because it's sort of, it's implicit. The drama, the fatalism is somewhat implied by the belief structures themselves. So just having a certain sort of sandbox that they've created of this autistic emulated subconscious that has certain beliefs operating within it, that gives them a certain sort of third eye, that gives them a certain sense of awareness that when they've got a certain um, person interacting with those structures in a certain way, that it's just the whole thing is going to crumble. The whole thing is going to, that there's an element that has sort of broken that tiny matrix, as it were. And in some sense, that's what the subconscious is. It's like a kind of a projective matrix to some degree, which, if it in a healthy person, is is actually projecting in an authentic way, in a good faith way, because that's part of the negotiation of the subconscious, that the subconscious is openly trying to make way for itself by contracting other people's subconscious, and that contracting be a free association, a voluntary contracting, people with their values on their sleeves, as it were, or trying to actually correspond honestly, um, and then also perhaps getting into discussion and argument and re-evaluating things jointly in a collective, when I say collective, in a coordinated way, the values of compromise and open, transparent communication and such. And you can see the failure to do this, it's sort of employing borderline or narcissistic or psychopathic elements, when you don't have the subconscious configurated to perform these high functioning, non-pathological things. And it's very hard for people to track these things. And Sattva types do have some clarity in their vision of these things because of the adjacency of their earth function and air function. But anyway, in the 12 model, their one set of 4 functions. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that, but that's a horrible tangent. But and I've already used metaphors to try and get into it. But okay, so let me continue. So I was just trying to make some general points about the subconscious. And then the ego function then starts sort of compiling meta-analysis of the contents of the subconscious to see sort of meta themes. And in some sense, that meta-analysis is great. It has the purview, or it has the potential of not only, let's say, generating insights or computing answers or computing perspectives that impinge against the structures of the inner child itself, and threatens to steal the seat of consciousness. There is a sort of an ordinarily, most of the time, there is an intrinsic, organic propensity for the ego function to try to take by force the seat of consciousness from wherever it may be and source it in itself. Because not only does it essentially have content that comes to bear against the inner child, but it also has content against the superego, which is the source of the inner child in the first place, which is something like the environmental self. So, and this is problematic because the ego function can be self-deluding in that very nuanced sense, in that it just sort of amalgamates everything into fighting the inner child, when it's not just fighting the inner child. It's antagonistic towards the inner child, but it has to be very careful to be sensitive to conflating the inner child with the superego, because if it doesn't do that, then essentially, to use an analogy, it's like in the Matrix movie, that the Matrix has been restarted many, many times, that the function of the one is just to be the background noise, the background control of picking up all the radicals, and then Scion has been rebuilt and many, many times. And there've been many, many different ones, because they haven't really been fighting the system. They've just been fighting the fake. They've been fighting the architect, whereas the actual thing of the machine world is much larger than that. So it's the sort of, it's not just the architect, and you can't go to war with the machine world, even though you might be antagonistic with the architect. And you have to somehow make peace with the machine. And now you see, this is never shown in the movie. It doesn't show the diplomacy between Neo and the machine world. And this is the biggest sort of thing that it doesn't go accounted for in the movie, although it is symbolized. You, you see Neo essentially prostrated, being carted off to go have diplomacy with the machines. In the sort of in the form of the crucifix. So it's sort of, it's symbolic in a deeper sort of sense. But anyway, that it requires quite a hefty doctrinal, sort of schema to sort all that stuff out. But anyway, so but this is let's say in the ordinary case, this is the role of the ego function, is that it has its own part to play, its own development, its own very tricky development to master, because in if it conflates the superego with the inner child, then essentially the subconscious becomes a sort of a bastardized playground where it knows that the subconscious is fundamentally disorientating and delusional in some sense, but it's not sensitive to the superego awareness, as it were. So when it's dealing in the subconscious, it has a kind of masterful control over the subconscious. The ego function can enter into the matrix and play with it and do what it wants, and fly around and things. And yes, it has all those sorts of powers. But what has this got to do with resolving the superego? Uh, okay, let me just complete. Okay, so I'm talking a little bit out of my immediate depth because I want to focus on other things, but um, and now I'm sort of talking about a sub issue within the ego function and not just outlining it. But I think it's important to try and get some kind of baseline as to the ideal functioning of these sides of the mind. So essentially, what the ego function has the capability of doing is resolving the whole false ego complex, I believe, by essentially fluidly allowing it to cycle in such a way, to fluidly cycle, seamlessly cycle, to sort of make itself transparent. And that the ego function has the sort of the meta resources to essentially, if it can marry itself to the problem that essentially, that the false ego complex was the solution to that problem. So, and the problem lies within the superego. So, in some sense, if the ego function just wants to sort of go be Superman in the subconscious, which it's fully capable of doing after it's worked out that the whole thing is just a control, is just a sort of control machination of the architect. And in some sense, this is the fundamental, let's say, disunity between the ego function and the inner child. That the ego function and the inner child are therefore setting themselves up as antagonists, and essentially the king of the inner child being the architect. Um, but there are also other figures in the inner child. It's not just the architect. It also, you can see the architect is somewhat the father of the whole thing. But the other aspects of the inner child, which would essentially be symbolized, well, the inner child doesn't just have its own child function. It also has a parent function. It also has a hero function. It also has a inferior function. And those are also all sort of symbolized, and in the Matrix quite beautifully. I'll add as well, that the Merovingian, the oracle, uh, and Agent Smith, the hero function, or the nemesis as it's called. And in some sense, the nemesis is there merely to try to keep the seat of consciousness in the inner child. Um, in some sense, I think maybe for each side of the mind, that could be what the hero slot is fundamentally tasked in doing. It's sort of in keeping the child function of that side of the mind enthroned, and by essentially enthroned in the seat of consciousness in some sense. And so at some point, at some late stage of development, when the ego function has already stolen the seat of consciousness in some sense, but the inner child then changes its mode, because in some sense then it starts to sort of, its inner child starts to value the ontological resource, and it actually sort of tries to model a split. It creates a two cities, sort of model of the seat of consciousness, and it says we are the ontological city, and the ego function is the epistemic city, and then these two cities essentially have to at some point come into anyway. I don't want to get too much into theories of self-actualization. That's not what this is meant to be. But anyway, let me just say that essentially, when the ego function, if it just wants to go be Superman in the subconscious, if Neo just wants to go fly around in the Matrix, he's not dealing with he's not dealing with the superego. In some sense, he's actually in quite a stupid reactive way. I mean, in a kind of meta-thematic way, I'm just going to describe him as that he effectively, he continues to subsist within the structures of the false ego complex, but he thinks that his arch enemy is the architect. So he's using the architect as both, let's say, the excuse to continue to enjoy the unlimited power over the subconscious, which he's somewhat become the architect. He's become a kind of pseudo architect. He's found a way to usurp the powers of the inner child, and has completely assimilated the power of the inner child, but not the ontological mandate. He hasn't absorbed let's say, the accountability that the inner child fundamentally answered. And so at some point, the epistemic thread needs to sort of cross the threshold of taking on board the ontological um, uh, implication on the epistemic context. So essentially, the epistemic context must make itself an ontological uh, consideration. The epistemic context must start to cater to an ontological consideration, and start to marry those two perspectives, as it were. And this is the proper sort of integration of the shadow. And then the subconscious becomes a mystery machine of fact-finding importance in some sense, because the actual, the content of the subconscious then becomes a clue and signifier of the superego. And I think you do have to trace what's going on in the superego before it starts to manifest exactly its contents, although there might also be more direct tools of essentially reaching into that. My theory could also be one of those tools, because simply by knowing the model and the shape of these things, then you would at least have a very good description or a primer of. That's quite embarrassing, because I haven't worked out which part of the false ego complex is being repeated by the superego, and I'd have to check some of my theory notes because the superego is not included in my metagram circuitry, but it is a repetition of one of the other two stages. Um, it might just be the superego inverted or something like that, um, which is why the superego. Sorry, when I just said superego, I meant it might be the subconscious inverted. Um, but with a particular ontological spin on that, and which would help you sort of interpret it in relation to the inner child. Okay, that's a bit sort of drawing board stuff, so it's sad to even bring it up, but sort of reverse engineering this stuff is, and then that on top of metatype in some sense is the best method I would have to actually thematically work out the contents of the superego. Did that also needs theoretical revision and refinement, but anyway, after I've sort of gotten a model that seems to, I mean, I guess I should look more at my own type and sort of anyway and try to see if I can fathom that out. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so now I've just gone over okay, so the reason of me talking about this is just to show the depth of how these things should actually be capable of doing these sorts of things. So that's the drama. That's almost the intrinsic drama that any false ego complex is just fundamentally saddled with, because these things by themselves don't make sense. Now, what a borderline has done and what a narcissist has done is essentially stopped the chain of progression or evolution, because they have essentially created amalgamates, solid state amalgamates of two sides of the mind, where the one side of the mind has essentially been annexed by another side of the mind, or at least a replica of that side of the mind has been annexed within one side of the mind. Or that's in the case of the narcissist. The psychopath, you've got these 2 points, the ego function and the inner child, that are sort of in a fixed solid state alignment. And this means that essentially there's a kind of symmetrical parallel correlate that it wants to impose on all the other sides of the mind. In some sense, the problem that the psychopath has is probably because although it can get the subconscious to fix itself in a kind of symmetrical parallel position, the superego then acts as a hard limiting factor that sort of outlines the whole sort of thing, and then they sort of get into a kind of existential mythology to sort of to placate that angst that would otherwise plague the ego function. And so they are developing a sort of subconscious obsession in order to divert pressure from the superego sort of mystery machines. So they're developing an obsessiveness over subconscious correlates in order to avoid, let's say, undermining the structure, the very delicate and fine structure and of this fixed, of these 2 points between the ego function and the unconscious side of the mind, or the inner child. Okay, anyway, okay, now the borderline in some sense has got practically 3 entities. They've got the psychopath, which is itself animating the borderline, which is itself animating the narcissist. And the narcissist is not even orchestrating things directly. The narcissist is using a subconscious sub-process of what I call the glasshouse defense. So the glasshouse defense is the first preferred mode of manipulation. And in some sense, they actually the narcissist won't even use the glasshouse directly. They will first be a narcissist, and then they will slowly increase the exposure of their targets to the glasshouse mode of manipulation. And then, so essentially, usually when you're dealing with them, you're actually, no, actually, you're not even when they the honeypot right at the start, in some sense, is a kind of like, is not just a narcissist that's trying to flatter you. It's like a psychopath narcissist that's trying to flatter you. So it's sort of like it's a narcissist with a psychopathic twinge of perfection in some sense. And depending on the level that that narcissist is at, because essentially the psychopath would like the narcissist to be successful in incepting a target or something like that. But if the narcissist is itself in bad shape, because essentially the ego function is puppet mastering this narcissist, and the narcissist is deploying the glass house. But essentially, the reason why the borderline can have such utter chaotic and self-destructive and just I'm just going to say chaos in general. The reason why they will deploy and be entrenched in so much confusion is because the narcissist is fundamentally it's paradoxical, because in some sense the narcissist is not meant to be a seat of consciousness. The narcissist is sort of in a covert way, it's rebelling against its own psychopathic pole in this dipole, and in some sense it's expecting the slack to be picked up by the ego function so that the ego function can prove its mastery. The problem is that if the ego function wants to be masterful, it has to have a single subconscious in order to pervade. And it doesn't have a single subconscious because there are many subconsciouses in the environment. There are many targets or whatever. So the narcissist in some sense compensates by adding, let's say, the strategy of codependency, that if it can fuse itself with another subconscious host, then the psychopath has a lever, has a tool to use. So this is why it's important that they choose someone. In some sense, it also forces the narcissistic aspect in the borderline is fundamentally a co-idealist vector of opportunism. They're only going to target someone, and this also then suits the narcissistic component to be, let's say, chaotic and pathological, because their standards are very high. That standard of co-idealism is incredibly high, but the co-idealism is not there. They don't actually care about co-idealism. They're not invested in the co-idealism like an actual narcissist would be. It's just there to sort of proof that the ego function is worthy to control, that their psychopathic ego function is worthy. Sorry, when I say worthy, I mean like that the vessel is worthy of being controlled by their ego function. They need a high status, a big power player, as it were, to satisfy the psychopathic element of the equation. So essentially, they are trying to do both at the same time. They are trying to be a successful psychopath as well as being a successful narcissist, and that means that their narcissism is not a failed narcissism, but it is overly complicated, and it does force it to sort of try to and let's just say it's internal stress in the narcissistic stress that, because let's just say it's okay, in some sense it is a flailing, it isn't a failing narcissist, it's a flailing narcissist, but that flailing is fundamentally a resource that it can use psychopathically, because it creates enough dramatic substance, enough descriptive internally, because you see, in some sense, the confusion and the convolution that the borderline is generating in its belief structures are all possible points of leverage that the psychopathic element can administer, can direct the inner child to compact into envelopes that then are delivered to the target subconscious and then decompartmentalizes them. Okay, so I have not done it eloquently, but I think I have actually purveyed the whole sort of structure of what's going on. Um, and then, so now let me just contrast this now fully with the psychopath. So, no, wait. Or did I want to contrast it with the narcissist? Yeah, the narcissistic psychopath. That's what I need to explain now. So, what is a narcissistic psychopath? Now, a narcissistic psychopath, I think, in some sense, is a completely different animal. In that the borderline is actually the seat of consistency is held by the psychopathy in the borderline case. The seat of consistency in the narcissistic psychopath is the inner child. So they are narcissistic before they are psychopathic. Okay, so that must be just taken as a practical fact, if nothing else. Now, they will activate the psychopath. Maybe I must actually listen to Sam Buckman talk about narcissistic psychopaths before I can actually give an intelligent reading of this. Because anyway, I'll just caveat this as it being roughly speculative. Essentially, what I believe happens is the narcissist has got enough experience playing in their sandcastles, playing in their autistic sandbox of an emulated subconscious, that they have actually created enough pseudo subconscious experience to develop an ego function or an ego function analysis over their own projects, over their own myriad projects, and to understand. So in some sense, they understand their own narcissism. Okay, so their ego function develops an awareness of their own narcissism, and they've jumped a whole stage. So they never put a seat of consciousness into their subconscious, but they have developed enough pseudo reference material that they have sort of generated a naive ego function, and then that ego function somehow sort of is, I think it might be like it might also, there might be subspecies, so that this might not be true in all psychopathic, not narcissistic cases, but the ego function might just sort of one day coalesce into into something that sort of rivals the seat of consciousness, but it doesn't, because it doesn't have a real subconscious to ground it. Its subconscious is the autistic structures in the inner child sandboxes, in some sense. So the ego function is like a cloud that appears over a certain confluence of contexts that occur. So in some sense, this psychopathic ego function is like a transient weather event that is dependent on whether the certain confluence of so in some sense they've got this, it's kind of like a oh man, this is a weak analogy, but it's like the cloud suddenly becomes the resident local deity in some sense. So it's like, it's sort of like, you're doing something outside and suddenly the weather changes radically and you think this is a pseudo religious, sort of sign from the gods. And then essentially you've got a certain cloud hovering above your head, and then you believe that essentially that is an omen. And essentially I think that the ego function of the psychopath in the narcissistic case, it has that kind of transient, impermanent presence. And perhaps if that omen is consistent enough, it might be able to over time fashion together a more comprehensive, coherent body of its expressing its sort of its intellectual analysis, as it were, its teleological outlook, and its framework of things. And so its framework, in some sense, because it's also not tethered to a subconscious, has a technical depth that might also rival ordinary. Their ego functions, in some sense, their psychopathic ego functions. In some sense, let me also just, in some sense, the narcissistic psychopath is very much a transient psychopath. They're not a consistent psychopath. So it's more like a psychopathic presentation, and it's not a permanent condition, as it were, or it might be persistent, but it's not persistent in a structured way. It's persistent in this haphazard, naive, implicit, it's a secondary manifestation of these structures, is what I'm just trying to say. But essentially, the reason why psychopath is it's more a psychopathic presentation than actual psychopathy, because I mean it's still a presentation of psychopathy. The behavior is still psychopathic. So sorry, the adjective certainly will apply, but let me just then define it. So the definition of psychopathy that I'm using is when the ego function is functioning in some form, but it essentially does not impose consistency on itself. That's what I believe psychopathy is. Psychopathy is having an empirical, teleological outlook and vision on things, and then not giving a damn that it's being self-contradictory, when it's being hypocritical in some sense. So not, but it's more than that, because hypocrisy is not the same thing as psychopathy. What I mean by that is that what I mean by hypocrisy in this context is that you have actually leveraged epistemic teleological outlook. You have actually employed it. You have actually you've in some sense you've put it into your subconscious mask. You've actually said, no, my subconscious mask is representative of my teleological empirical outlook. And then you suddenly forget about it, seemingly. It suddenly evaporates. It goes missing from the record. It just sort of gets misplaced. It gets autistically revised, and no one is informed about it. It just goes missing in the woodwork, and something else takes its place. And in some sense, it's like a revised historical reference. It's like, Stalin changing the pictures of the old comrades, which have been removed, and then they have been removed from history. It's that kind of editing of history that is the psychopathy, where it's just a level of malicious, deceitful inconsistency in some sense. Because now, as I say, it's wrong to sort of, I think on some sense, it's wrong to describe a narcissist like that, in terms, because it's not a characterological property, it's a structural property. It's not, their ego function doesn't belong to them. It's a transient phenomena, but it is, I mean, they should still be made accountable for it, essentially. I mean, this is the only thing, is the only way to actually root the ego function is to rebuke someone and to hold them into account for it. Essentially, you can't just say, well, this is part of how you can't normalize pathology to the extent to which that you give people special privileges. And in some sense, this transient event, or this transient structure, or whatever, or it's not, the whole structure isn't transient, but it has a transient property, would become solidified if it essentially had to steelman itself, and it would steelman itself under the pressure of confrontation and rebuke, and needing to sort of develop justification for itself. Obviously, a narcissist wouldn't want to do this, because that would essentially, I'm going to perhaps use some words a bit creatively and inconsistently with Sam Vaknin's jargon, but that would effectively mortify their sandboxes. It would mortify their use of their sandboxes, and that would effectively force them to spill out into a subconscious. It would force that it would force contending with the real subconscious. Okay, I'm a bit tired now, so I want to stop this recording. But I think, although ineloquently I have surveyed the full gambit of these issues, uh, and at least the main substance, I think I have expounded on. So, but I'm worried. I have so much on my plate now to deal with. I'm sort of, I'm actually behind in three different projects at the moment. But anyway, so it's going to be a while before I work out if I'm going to upload the recordings that I made, because actually when I said that there were 3 hours of recordings, it's more like probably 4.5 hours, and it just has a lot of shit in it. It just has a lot of bad things and horrible tangents, and then it has some very insightful things which weren't included in this, although this is a fairly good. I guess maybe I'm just too vain about some of my tangents. Maybe, probably not that good. Anyway, and I need to get on top of some other things. Let me just point something out, which I think is very important. And this is also why it pains me so much when I listen to people like Sam Vaknin talk about borderline, because I realize that there is. I mean, look, you can't apply faults to this, because the psychology is just not fully understood. But when I see people sympathizing with the narcissistic aspect of the borderline, this is so far from getting anywhere. It is a waste of time. When the borderline is actually in the psychopathic mode, you are much closer to doing anything real. You actually, if you could just seclude the psychopathic aspect and address that and attend to that and do therapy with that. Obviously, this is the problem: is that um, you're dealing with a stable commodity, but then you're dealing with something that is just so entrenched in its own fundamental bad faith, as it were, because it is a full-blown psychopath. So essentially, you're dealing. I mean, this is the problem with borderline, and this is the problem with psychopathy, is that because it's got this diversionary instrument, it can insulate its psychopathy from even having to sort of, like, I mean, I can deal. I have dealt with psychopaths. It's really possible to do that. I mean, it can be problematic because their inner world is sometimes not fleshed out in proper communicative grammar, as it were. But it is possible to it's easier with the ones that play these intellectual games, but they because they consider themselves to be very proficient at being communicative and things like that, but they often have philosophical structures which there's bullshit in them, and they won't even believe that there could be bullshit in them. But after you prove to them that their structures are bullshit, or at least some of them are, and then the actual insideness of the psychopathy is itself a fundamentally convoluting on a very sort of on a very it's hard to pinpoint it, because it can almost never be described in words, but they actually have a sort of a source code engine for their psychopathy, which essentially is kind of like an unresolved confusion. It's like a non-computable field in which you just have to deal with it. You just have to be a kind of an operator of that and a contender. You force yourself to be a contender, and being a contender on that issue, in that paradigm, in that field, essentially all the other psychopathic aspects are uh, um, are all premised on that fundamental astigmatization. So, but it's very hard to locate that astigmatization with a psychopath. You have to already you have to reach a kind of level of because I mean they will even let you get close to it without you getting close to it because it's too sensitive to them as well. So they will actually create a sub philosophical contention because they just think that they're feeding you what you want to hear, and they will entrance you and things like that because that's what they like doing. But then even privately they will come to you perhaps and maybe even fakely a few times because they are fixed in this astigmatization, they are fixed in this confusion, and so they themselves are a bit hopelessly lost because they don't even know how they're hopelessly lost because that's part of being what being lost is. And essentially it is a bit hard to locate essentially the implements of that listlessness in some sense, which the contention of that listlessness is the sort of is the metaphysical armor of the psychopathic behavior and general presentation. Okay, now borderlines have that same precondition, but then they never have to deal with it because they can explore it metaphorically through the narcissistic glass house defense in some sense. They might be exploring it on some vague level through the medium of their more sophisticated, complicated form of self puppeted vector of mastery over external subconscious minds and controlling. Um, in some sense, you can understand a borderline if you just say, okay, well, they're psychopathic about one topic, about one subject, which is control itself. And so they're kind of like psychopathic psychologists in some sense. Um, and I would posit that the reason why they do this is simply because this is how a female psychopath develops. Because when a male psychopath develops, they're playing with little toys that look like things and mechanics, and in some sense, and maybe life and death or something like that, and maybe their own mortality in, as part of this conceptual plane and paradigm that they're sort of dealing with. But borderlines are dealing with dolls, or I mean girls are playing with dolls. They're playing with interrelated. That's what they're exploring. So they're not exploring things; they're exploring people, and so their psychopathy essentially just develops this more complicated psychological mechanism of control, as it were. The psychological life force, rather than the more ordinary psychopaths, let's say, materialization of a life force, which is itself also generally a metaphor for this internal contention. Anyway, so my comment here is just basically, you want to be dealing with the psychopath in the borderline. You really do. That's what you want to be talking to. The problem is that when it rears its head, it's instead of being honest about itself or whatever, it's just protecting its instrument. It's just protecting its narcissism. The psychopathy is just protecting the narcissism, but that is because it is the parent of the narcissistic arm, of the procedure. So in some sense, it's much closer to real psychopathy than it is to narcissism, which in some sense is a kind of almost transient, phased psychopathy, which in some sense they are psychopathic. The narcissist is psychopathic. They are not, and they might have a style of psychopathy, but they in some. Okay, I've laid out that distinction, so I'm not going to continue to labor that point. So anyway, yeah. So if you really want to ever make ground, now I do think that in some sense the solution of the psychopath is to revert them back to narcissists. Now this is doubly confusing in the borderline case, because you need to get them to a narcissistic phase before their puppeted narcissistic phase that is puppeted by the psychopathy, and that requires good amounts of time dealing with the psychopath. And generally, when they are exposing their psychopath, they are doing it just to make it so uncomfortable, just to punish people for making them bring it out, so that they can revert back to the glasshouse defense, they can revert back to the narcissism. And this is why I'm so incensed when I hear St. Wagner say all these sympathetic things about borderlines. Because all you're fucking doing is essentially making excuses for people to revert back into, let's say, the middle of their. Anyway, okay, I've made the point. I'm not going to belabor it. It's a therapeutic stalemate. Essentially, that's why I'm so incensed about it. Anyway, I just wanted to add that point. I think that was an important point to add. So I'm going to stop the recording. Alright, so I'm going to continue to make this recording just to round off this issue, because I guess it is an important issue, and I'm not going to deal with it comprehensively or anywhere close to exhaustively. But on the issue of therapy. So obviously the problem is when it's a bit confusing when I say they need to revert back to I mean that in the same way that Sam Buckner talks about, how everyone talks about the natural, organic, narcissistic phase of very young children. So the problem is that because the psychopath is already used to puppeteering an inner child narcissism, this is right in their fucking wheelhouse. So when you're negotiating with the psychopath and you're thinking that you're trying to sort of facilitate them, they want to go back to a valence of narcissism because they've got a million of them which they play out in their glass house. That's how that psychopath relates to people or functions. Is it functions through narcissistic incarnations. So what can be said? So the way to deal with this is you actually have to, I would say, focus on making the psychopathic elements presentable. Focus on actually normalizing the psychopathic element. When I say normalizing it, I mean making it preferable to the narcissistic thing. Make the psychopathic element the stable presentation. So it would actually be a step up to get the borderline to present as a full-blown antisocial personality disorder. Obviously, perhaps with some alleviated now I can you can really see how this sounds. This sounds crazy. Like, well, how the fuck is that ever going to be approved by some legal body, or something like that? But that would actually be a step in the right direction. Uh, so anyway, moving on. So at least then, if you can stabilize the psychopathic thing, then at least you can start to unwork. I mean, this is what dialectical behavior therapy is essentially doing in some sense. It's trying to concretize the ego function and solidify it into a stable, into the stable sort of seat of consciousness that it already has, but it's used to cloaking itself in inner child narcissistic valences. So it's used to relating to people through a myriad, through the sort of this myriad projector of essentially reconstituting and sort of throwing away its ostensible glass house, and repopulating the internal drama, and essentially by having an audience to that, by having a targeted audience, it can sort of it can psychopathically map out coercive, manipulative forms of whatever. So essentially, you're cutting out the glass house defense. Whatever you have to do to sort of essentially take the glass house mechanism off the table, or at least to banish it. And now this is problematic because the ego function, the psychopathic ego function, can not use the glass house directly, but can also sort of use it indirectly, because they can intellectually say, well, if you do this, then I'll do that. They can sort of, what's the word? They can still leverage it thematically, and in some sense that's no different. That's what they were always doing anyway. In fact, that's what they do sometimes when you get the psychopathic voice, when the voice, I've described it as the voice in the clouds. And then you think, and then you can really see the psychopathic element, that you thought you were dealing with a kind of narcissistic, infantile, sort of thing, but actually that's just the one arm, and the true arm, and the dominant arm in some sense is this. Sometimes you hear that even it speaks in its own voice. The voice, it doesn't speak through the surreptitious deployment of the narcissistic decompartmentalization, through the kind of the glass house exposure that they are attaching to other people. And so essentially they are often actually voicing, the voice of the ego function is there to sort of cement that they are obliging somebody else to be exposed to their to absorb their glass house apparition. Because essentially it gives them more, it gives them a buffer. It gives the psychopath a kind of a field of insulation, which then they can never be called out on, essentially, because then they can always just essentially use themselves. They can sacrifice their own pawn, because their own pawn is their narcissistic valence just being displaced by a new narcissistic valence. Okay, I'm repeating myself, but and this also works ideologically. Identity politics is exactly the same thing, and you can see this, for example, I mean, the kind of the hysteria that they create over political issues, where they drum up issues which aren't real issues, where they complain about complexities just to sort of get their way because it's too complicated. You can see this in the Brexit sort of thing, that, oh, this issue is way too complicated to be resolved, so we just better keep the status quo. It's sort of, it's that kind of hostage taking, sort of leveraging of complexity in a weird sort of cherry picked way, where they will sort of pretend to, like, magnify an issue and go into the details and pretend that they know it so well or whatever, and it's all bunk, it's all, tremendously trumped up, speciously framed, um, because essentially they've got a foregone vision, they've got a foregone teleological outlook, um, and they're not dealing in, let's say, the calibration of those facts in any kind of intellectually um, coherent or even anyway, the kind of anyway, I would say what I was just describing is a theme of a kind of psychopathic style of coercion. um, is sort of like the kind of the salt the earth sort of thing in terms of fact finding. Anyway, anyway, this has so many parallels with ideological things. But anyway, I'm not gonna. Let me just focus, because I'm trying to get into sort of an outline of some kind of therapy process or whatever. So what you want to do. Okay, now, so essentially you'll find that the psychopathy, in some sense, is just obsessed with control. That it has one objective, it has one aim, and in some sense, it doesn't even have a good excuse for why it needs the control. It's like its excuse is simply, I want nice things, or something like that. Like, the psychopathic element is just greedy, in essence. And it wants to insulate that greed, and sort of once it created this whole. So, I mean, it's actually incredibly immature. The whole psychopathic element is itself, in fact, it would love to have more of a traumatic story to justify itself. It would love, because essentially that just plays into the narcissistic game playing, as it were. But in some sense, it was just chosen out of, well, this is how my environment seems to function in a similar kind of way. I'm going to conquer it through undermining it, through so, I mean, obviously, there's generally speaking, there's something to complain about in the environment. There's always something to complain about in any environment anyway, but essentially, in some sense, I think that borderline is a product of in some sense, I think the psychopathy um, develops first, and then the trauma somewhat shows them an example of the narcissistic ploy to deploy in their glass house exhibition. So the trauma is not the ontological cause of the psychopathy, but it is the epistemological fuel for the content of the mechanism. Anyway, and so you have to understand that when you're dealing with the psychopath, you're not dealing. It's not a child of trauma, and in fact, dealing with the trauma side is really, again, you're putting out the wrong fire. Stabilize the psychopath and treat the psychopathy. And then essentially after that stabilized, then you can try to get back to essentially starting afresh, as it were, and actually going back to the inner child, and then from that baseline reconstituting an inner child and a subconscious, and let's say revivifying the inner child that has been fundamentally fragmented by this puppeteering ego function, by this puppeteering psychopathic ego function that has used part of its own internal ontological. So in some sense, borderlines have a confused ontology. because their inner child has been fractured by their psychopathy, which which is kind of the same thing as a regular psychopath. In fact, it's not different from a regular psychopath, but at least a regular psychopath, all you are dealing with is the ego function's defense mechanisms and their subconscious um, deceitfulness, as it were. So a psychopath will have layers of subconscious insulation, which is just intrinsic to the structure of their psychopathy. You can't fault them for that in some sense, but you can wade through them, and you can eventually metaphorically get to their internal thing that they're contending. It's not easy. I don't think that this I consider myself a bit of a psychological prodigy, that I've been dealing with this my whole life. So obviously I have resources that other people don't in being able to deal with these sorts of things. Um, but I would say that this is not achieved mostly by clinicians. Clinicians are nowhere close to doing that kind of work anyway. But I'm just I'm contrasting that dealing with the psychopath like that is obviously it's harder to deal with the borderline, because their subconscious insulation, as it were, is bound with the fragmentation or even a pseudo fragmentation of their inner child. Which they are actively perpetrating that fragmentation. The psychopath, the pure psychopath, is not actively convoluting their inner child. The borderline is. And then essentially they play this game where essentially you can try to deal with their inner child. And this is a huge problem. You need to get them to deal with their own inner child. You cannot deal with their inner child because you're going to step on their booby traps. You're going to trip over their tripwires, and then they are just going to hold you to psychopathic account. They're going to have a ledger where you didn't treat their and that game is impossible to win, because they don't have the good faith to actually have those things mended, because they're psychopaths still. And that is actually how you heal psychopathy, is you get them to tend to their own inner child, as it were, and to reforge a new reconciliation, where essentially you have a more dynamic, you don't have a straight line between the ego function and the inner child. You use the conduit of the subconscious. That is, you rehabilitate the facility that the subconscious is structurally designed to do. But first you have to sort of show the inadequacy of the direct tethering between the ego function and the child, in order to remove the symmetrical correlate that the subconscious essentially is just like a dull reflection, or a kind of vassal annexed sort of store of extra capacity. In some sense, psychopath doesn't need a subconscious. They're not like narcissists. They don't need to be enabled by their subconscious. It's an extravagant, decadent extra, right? They've already got this internal structure. Yes, they'll get bored, so that they'll have to do something, so that they will have to sort of gamble. In some senses, like going to the casino. That's when they have set their sights on a subconscious target. They know that it's only emblematic of their internal sort of structure, of some internally vectored object, and they are just dealing with the reflection of that object, and in some sense they're always dealing with pale reflections. So it's not. They're not even necessarily that invested in it, but they are at risk, because whatever they have invested in it it might require them to escalate in order to recoup that investment, because they cannot lose on their investment. They cannot they if they appear to lose, they have to regard it as not it being a real loss, because if it is a real loss, it's impossible. So, and that's when you get the kind of the scary psychopathic escalation. Now you've got the same thing happening with the borderline and the glasshouse defense, which is why I get so incensed when I hear people sympathizing with the fucking glass house, with the glass houses. Like, what are you doing? You're just deferring this forever. You're getting into therapeutic stalemate, and it's hard. It's hard to look. I know it's hard, but I mean, I guess maybe this will make it easier. You have more of an outline of what you're dealing with. But I mean, this is if they know that they have been seen, that they are an open book, that you can see more than what they profess to ostensibly hold out, and there's a culture that actually has that kind of vigilance, that has that kind of penetrative analysis. If you have vigilant gatekeepers that can have that kind of penetrating gaze, they're fucked. They can't operate. And it's the same with ideology as well. But anyway, I'm not going to make political parallels, although there are many political parallels to make with identity politics and the fascism of this. I mean, it's actually almost wonderful that we had this coronavirus, because it's almost like a neutral political event to just show the fascistic hysteria that is innate, the groupthink that is so active within the population, which has been cultivated by these academic cults of identity politics and shit like that. Peddling their narcissistic, slimy, historical. I mean, please. I'm just going to make this little parallel. I mean, who cannot see the parallel between Aryan studies and race and gender studies? How is this not exactly the same thing? All you have done is replaced genetic superiority with moral superiority and collective systemic guilt. How is that not the same system of mythologized moral narrative? You know, where people are forced to get their moral consideration from their group, from being members in some group. And when moral consideration is systemized like that, and it's put into the legal theory, I mean, then you have a fascistic culture, you have a fascistic politics. And essentially the problem is that where does accountability go? Is when people are not accountable to the individual, they're accountable to the identity, then they can play this game where even people who are members of that identity that is supposedly being helped are thrown under the bus, and there's no real political accountability, because there's no way to test if the policy is functional or not, because the generalization, oh, it's good for the identity in general, can always be used as an excuse to cover over the corruption, of which there is intrinsic moral corruption in this way of constructing a legal apparatus, government policy. It is fundamentally moral corruption. It's fundamentally fascistic. Fascistic political conception of conceptualization of society, and framing of society. And this lost accountability, I mean, is the sort of is the same sort of thread, is the same conceptual thread as the joint accountability that the borderline is trying to do with its target. It's trying to essentially, this is what eventually happens when it manages to actually find a target that will absorb its displays of the glass house, is that eventually it reconfigures this slightly into a house of mirrors, in which it can use the other subconscious to fill in the gaps between the house of mirror, in that, to fill the room of the house of mirrors in an atmosphere of a joint accountability, so that the narrative of the psychopath will just be able, can be just be freely, the environment is fundamentally conducive to making the voice of the psychopath, and the psychopath's control, to just validate it automatically. And essentially, they do this by effectively switching places with their target. That they say, okay, well, actually, the target created this whole environment. The target created this whole situation. The target ontologically caused everything. And so they become the voice of essentially, they rewrite history, they do all these weird sort of crafty things, and sort of, they become a sort of like a power unit, but the other person holds all the responsibility, and they hold all the voice of accountability. So they get to reference, they get to issue what makes accountability. This is how fascist culture also works with the mob, whether you have the Führer, which is like holds the responsibility, and then you have the mob, the collective, the identity that holds the spirit of the accountability that needs to be pandered to by the Führer, by the savior. It's the same relation. And there are philosophical correlates to this, but I'm not going to go too much into the politics. But there's another thing that I wanted to say about the borderline. Damn, what was it now? Yeah, I probably need to become more familiar with histrionic to make better things about that, because I don't know what I'm referring to when I call something a cerebral histrionic. I made my own definitions already for that, but it might simply be the kind of, they see it, their seat of consciousness is actually in the subconscious, and it's almost like an inversion of this, but they see it from, again, I don't want to go into that. Damn, there was this other point that was important that I wanted to bring up. What was it? Accountability. Oh yes, the responsibility and accountability thing. So the proof of any kind of real progress with borderline, and this is, and in some sense you're getting on with the process if they can actually tolerate, essentially, if they can stay in the psychopathic sphere of operational management, and then they can actually tolerate frustration as a psychopath, then you're sort of actually, if they don't suddenly just revert into creating inner child valences, or glass house defense levers of manipulation and coercion and compulsion. So yeah, I mean, and this is why dialectical behavior therapy works like it does, is because it is equipping the ego function with essentially with a way to deal with things and manage things without resorting to this kind of myriad inner turmoil as a vector of subconscious compulsion of others. But it's still premised on essentially equipping the psychopath with other instruments of control which are less toxic or less pathological or less self-convoluting in some sense. But anyway, the actual real progress, and I'm just going to sketch this out as an outline, the actual, let's say, the teleological progress of actually starting to make inroads into dealing with the psychopathy is what I would call the fusion of responsibility and accountability. Because you see, this is the ego function is itself a way of analyzing accountability. It is a repository of a ledger of accountability. And this is the judgmental tone that you get, that psychopathic judgmental tone that borderlines exert. Sometimes when you hear that voice in the clouds, when you hear that switch, as Sam Wagner described it, you need to hear that voice of accountability, and then you need to hear it take responsibility at the same time. Responsibility that it apportions not to one of its narcissistic valences, not to one of its glass house permutations, but that it actually takes responsibility for it in the present, and it actually allows itself to be, to burden active responsibility. Now you have to be careful, because it will burden active responsibility at the cost of convoluting the accountability account. You see, it's got two sides of the same trick to pull. So either in the psychopathic voice, it will profess accountability, and responsibility will be diverted onto somebody else, or onto a collective, onto the subconscious collective, onto a grouping, onto some kind of category. It'll be diluted. It'll be dispersed. Dispersal is the best word. That it will manage to voice it'll manage to voice an accounting of accountability, but it won't at the same time voice responsibility in a way that isn't dispersed throughout a kind of subconscious complex. You see, you need the responsibility to be actively compressed into their own subconscious mask, into a single subconscious. They need to actually be the, now this issue is slightly complicated, because in some sense, you can't make everyone the reason for everything in the world, right? But that's the difference between ontological and epistemological. So this is a bit philosophical, and so this is a little bit complicated, but essentially you have to understand that your subconscious mask must take ontological responsibility, active ontological responsibility, because it has to fucking respond. So it has to take full ontological responsibility. It doesn't necessarily have to take epistemological responsibility. It doesn't take active epistemological responsibility, because it can actually revise itself, it can rename itself, it can reconstitute itself, it can recapitulate itself. It can say, look, I've got it wrong. And so when it says, look, I've got it wrong, I'm going to reconstitute my subconscious mask, it can narrate that, it can communicate that, it can negotiate that. But it must also then, when it's negotiating that, it doesn't just do it unilaterally. It actually has to say, well, ontologically, now I'm burdened with essentially making it true for other people, if it is going to be true for other people, or I have to know that it's not true for other people, and I have to ontologically take heed of that, and see myself as being the ontological cause of that. And if it doesn't make itself the ontological cause, if it's not ontologically responsible in that way, that's the active responsibility. It's not active epistemic responsibility. And please remember, I'm talking about the subconscious here. I'm not talking about the whole thing. Obviously, the ego function has epistemic responsibility, but the subconscious has ontological responsibility. Okay, so I know this is getting a bit philosophical, but these concepts are very hard to to impart in therapy or whatever, because they're very highfalutin. They require a form of, there's probably easier ways of translating this into workbooks, into things that where you actually, I'm sure actually there are probably things in Scientology that actually some books, some of the books in Scientology probably impart that within the pages, within the words, they have these distinctions laden. I'm just giving the conceptual outlook. But anyway, essentially that is the form in which real healing, let's just say, of the psychopathy in the borderline actually takes place. When they have active epistemic responsibility or epistemic accountability issued from the ego function in tandem with active ontological responsibility. So they've got active epistemic accountability being issued from the ego function, and they've got active ontological responsibility being issued by the subconscious. And then you've got actually a stable, you've actually got a stable identity that is also capable of renaming itself, recharacterizing itself, evolving itself, adapting itself. It doesn't have to be locked into a particular thing and then force that fixed correlation onto its system to absorb some kind of, because nothing can stay exactly the same. And so when it has to sort of make some alterations, it has to find an excuse to project that onto somebody else's integrity, onto somebody else's subconscious. It sort of has to divert that into somebody else's responsibility, which it has fundamentally sort of subverted and merged with, because essentially it has just portrayed it through some kind of essentially glass house exhibition. Okay, so now you see that I've just described it backwards in some sense, but from the other side. Okay, look, I've gone over this backwards and forwards, but essentially that's important, that when you actually have this dual property of responsibility and accountability that's properly calibrated, that is the only measure of real progress within. That is the only measure of real progress within borderline. Everything else you can say is maybe you can make some tangible differences in, I don't even know how you would measure them, but I wouldn't call them psychological improvements. What I've just outlined, I believe, is the only psychological improvement. Everything else is just window dressing, is just all you can maybe, I don't know what measure you have, but they're not psychological measures in some sense. I mean, they're perhaps measures of gratification for the structures that already exist. Anyway, now, okay, I've fully dealt with this now, so now I don't have to make any more recordings on this, at least for a long time. I can go focus on my other